like it. You want a podcast like it? Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. Just podcast like it. Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. You want a podcast like it? 1999.
Welcome to Podcast Like It's 1999. I'm your host, Phil Iskov, and with me today, I am very pleased to say, is Paul Redford, writer-producer on The West Wing. In season 1, he co-wrote The State Dinner, The White House Pro-Am, and Take the Sabbath, which he won a Humanitas Award for, was nominated also for a WGA award for that episode. And in the second season, he co-wrote The Portland Trip, The Leadership Breakfast, and Somebody's Going to Emergency, Somebody's Going to Jail, which he was again nominated for a WGA award for. And also co-wrote many episodes in season 3, 4, and 5. Thank you so much for being here, Paul. I very much appreciate it.
I very much appreciate being here. It's so good to hear all the appreciation for West Wing.
I as you very well know, I've been doing this miniseries for a few months now, and I'm just thrilled to talk with someone that was there, that was in the trenches, that was a fundamental part of this process. And I because of the saying that I'm sure our listeners want to hear all about your journey. So let's kind of rewind for a second, go back to 1999. I know it's a little while ago now, but how did the West Wing come into your life, and sort of what was that early days like?
It came into my life through Aaron Sorkin, who's had nothing but a beneficial effect on my life and career.
Sure.
I was writing in 98, 99. I was a staff writer on Sports Night, which was his first television show, and was kind of a TV breakthrough in its own right, because it was, that was the era when television was all, fortunes were to be made, and everybody was watching NBC on Thursday night, and everyone was watching the great multi-camera sitcoms, half hours. That was the form, that was the dominant form in TV.
Sure.
And that was where all the best writing was and where the best acting was, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinions, and also where an enormous audience was that we'll never see again.
Not that the West Wing didn't have an enormous audience, because it very much
West
did.
Wing had an enormous audience, but we considered ourselves almost weirdly an underground kind of hit, because we weren't getting the enormous numbers of a Seinfeld or a Friends or an ER. So Sports Night was ABC's attempt to kind of, grab some of that NBC prestige money.
Sure.
It was a very smart, funny show, but it was also not written in the style of a multi-camera sitcom, in that the jokes were not kind of standalone jokes, kind of 5 per minute, which is really the structure of even the best of the, the multi-camera ones. Was much more character related, much more story related, and filmed at a very fast pace by Tommy Schlamme, and written, with Aaron's signature. He's the Duke Ellington of dialogue. I mean, it was just, his phenomenal sense of writing and writing for actors. So that was a thrill for me, because I was coming out of my last job before Sports Night was on Coach, which I don't think was still on in 99, so it doesn't fall under the purview
It was not.
of the show. It was certainly in the line of classic comedies, along the line of created by all the people who did Cheers and Taxi and a show I'm still very fond of, and that launched a lot of great writing careers in comedy. And I don't include myself, because
sure.
I was just a beginner on Coach, and Sports Night to me was a wonderful transition to something with more decent hours. I mean, I had just married my wife, Nancy. We were trying to get a family. And in those days, writing comedy, if you were writing half-hour comedy, it was perfectly standard to be there till, it wasn't funny till it was 3 a.m. and you were on your 15th version of a joke.
Isn't anything funny at 3 a.m. though? I mean, let's be real.
Everything's funny at 3 a.m., I guess.
Yeah.
But I was tired of, going out the studio gates just as everyone was arriving for work. That was really my experience of writing half-hour comedy. Sports Night was much more civilized, partly because Aaron wrote so much of it. He really just needed us around, the rest of the staff around to, give him story ideas and, the occasional jokes. But he was really master of his domain in that whole area. And then while working on Sports Night, Aaron called a bunch of us junior writers in and said, well, what do you think about Rob Lowe? And we said, what do you mean Rob Lowe? I mean, because at that point, Rob, God bless him, was best known for a sex tape and, a career that was kind of ended. Yeah. And we said, well, we don't know. And he said, well, I've got this pilot, this political show. We're casting it. And, kind of out of the blue, Rob came in to read for a role. And here's the thing, he's actually really good. If we cast him, though, do you think it would, his reputation or anyway? It was a funny question. We all said, go ahead and cast him. And then I asked Aaron if I could, look at the pilot. They had actually shot the pilot while we were doing Sports Night. With the same director, Tommy, who was working on it with us on Sports Night. And I was astounded. I mean, I knew that Tommy and Aaron together were making great TV on Sports Night, but this was, and I told Aaron that, this is the best pilot I've ever seen of any TV show. And I know, we're coming back for a second year on Sports Night. I know this is a little unusual, but if you need writers on West Wing, if the show goes, I would be thrilled, because honestly, I could already tell that West Wing was, much as I like Sports Night, West Wing was really the kind of show I would have dreamed of writing at that point.
Well, it does feel like, Sports Night kind of, it had a laugh track, then it didn't have a laugh track. It was a show that never fully, totally hit, to your point, because it didn't fall into the kind of a Friends mold, if you will. Mm-hmm. West Wing is so fully formed from the jump. Like it's yes. There are a handful of pilots. I'm sure, we could name them, but shows that from the pilot, just hit the ground running.
Very few. I mean,
very few.
The one I always would think of in my field in comedy was Frasier. Frasier was the one show, but it's probably because they had developed those characters and that voice. Right. Through so many years of Cheers. Normally, particularly in comedy, but also in drama, you need a year to kind of find what the show is and who your characters are. And with so many shows, including the great Seinfeld and all that, everyone will tell you, it's what everyone told you about Schitt's Creek is like, look, give it a chance, get through the first year. Get through the first 4 episodes of anything. Well, the first 4 episodes of West Wing were, they were the show fully formed.
Well, this is sort of
as good as 5 years later. So,
well, this speaks to a difference back in the day to now, which is that you do have a fair amount, far more than ever before, series orders, right? Yes. Back in the day, and still, in broadcast television and some cable places, you write a pilot, you shoot a pilot, the pilot is screened for your various executives at the top of the network chain, and then they decide whether or not they're going to go to series with it. So you really have a gap there, right? I mean, you've got a couple months, and then you've got a gap of when your writer's room is breaking your season, writing your first couple episodes in a vacuum before it even airs, right? So you guys are doing this on season 1 of West Wing, then the show premieres, and you're seeing how the show is embraced, what things are working, what things perhaps aren't working as much. And I certainly need to ask your thoughts on Mandy. But I want to sort of, and this is nothing denigrating to Moira
not
Kelly,
at all.
because she seems lovely and wonderful. But
and honestly,
I
I was most excited about Moira Kelly on the show, because I didn't know. I knew Martin.
Right.
And I always knew John Spencer was a great actor, but I'd never seen the other guys. And I don't know. Cutting Edge is still one of my.
It's great. It's great. I love
favorite
it.
Figure skating hockey romantic.
Totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And written by a fellow Canadian. So there's that.
Yes.
Too.
Yes.
But I do think that I kind of want to hone in on, because this is a notoriously unorthodox writer's room in the sense of how the episodes are broken, how the episodes are written. And I kind of want to just know what those first couple months were like, as you sort of, as you and Aaron and the other writers kind of found the show, figured out what the voice of the show was, and also worked within this unorthodox method of writing.
Well, I think that goes to, and I don't know if your larger themes of what 99, what happened in 99, but 99 was also really, I think, the birth of whatever you're going to call it, auteur television, of television with with a singular voice that you before this only saw in feature films. So I think that was the strength of West Wing just coming out of the gate. It was an auteur TV show. Aaron was. I never saw him or heard him take a network or a studio note. I never.
It's a luxury.
I never even. He refused to even talk about upcoming episodes or how the season would go in front of executives. And he was so, I think, supported and protected by his other two executive producers, John Wells, who is a genius of the medium, and a genius, showrunner producer, made sure everything was in place for Aaron to do what Aaron did. The only writer I think comparable to Aaron, at least an hour before that, would have been David Kelly, who did, was able to sit down, and I know this from writers who worked with him on their shows, could write a whole episode in an afternoon.
On paper.
Aaron wasn't quite that fast. Yes,
ruled paper.
Yes, with his famous,
I
think in pencil, and he had there's only one secretary or assistant in the world who could read his handwriting. Aaron was comparable. I mean, it would take him longer, and Aaron really did for all his. He was not as much as I think, and I only know this by reputation, a recluse like Kelly, because Kelly shuts the door and writes everything. Aaron shuts the door, writes a scene, opens the door, runs into the writing room, says, "What's next?"
Okay.
So much like Bartlett. I mean, the relationship of Bartlett and the staff on the show is, that's one model for it, is Aaron's relationship to his own staff.
That's really interesting, because a lot of people talk about Mad Men and how Matt Weiner really kind of looked at the ad world similarly to the writer's world, right? Like the way that Don talks to the various people that work with him is, I imagine, somewhat similar to the way Matt Weiner talks to his writers.
I mean, certainly, it's a drama of egos. It's a drama of ambition, and it's a very strange thing for writers to write together. I think for thousands of years, probably back to Homer, it's the writer works alone. The actors and everybody else, that's the collaboration, is once it gets to the set or once it gets on stage.
Well, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to kind of underline and ask you a question on, which is, auteur television is kind of being birthed at this moment, right? Like you guys are at the tip of the spear. You've got Sex and the City's in its second season. Sopranos premieres in January of 99. You guys premiere obviously in September of 99. As a writer back then, The Sopranos must have felt like an earthquake, right? Like, wait,
it was tremendous.
we can do this now? Like that's, you know what I mean? Like that's a completely game-changing moment. And for you guys to be sort of, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it, the standard bearers of broadcast television for the 4 years that you won Best Drama, and it was sort of, what was that like to sort of feel that push and pull at that time? Did it feel as seismic as I imagine it must have? But
Sopranos certainly felt seismic. We didn't feel seismic. We felt, certainly that first year in '99, right, we kind of wondered, you know, who's watching. Our number, you know, we were not you know, there were these shows that were massive hits out of the gate, like ER, which was again almost like Fully Formed, and that was John Wells's show before West Wing. And later on, Desperate Housewives and Grey's Anatomy, they were you know, tremendous, and they were in the cultural conversation like right away. West Wing, it felt like, well, we guess somebody's watching us. But you know, all the critical and all the attention of all the like smart writers, it's all Sopranos. I mean, I do have this great memory of every Monday morning in the writers' room. The first hour or two would be a discussion of what was on Sopranos the night before and how great Sopranos was, and we had to be very careful, because if Aaron would come in and hear us, you know, extolling Sopranos, it would drive him crazy.
I'm sure.
I can understand. I mean, what was he paying us for? Do you know? Not to, you know,
well, but it's
the Sopranos.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are just doing something so drastically dissimilar too, right? Like,
exactly.
it is interesting because I do feel like, and I want to hone in a bit about Take This Sabbath Day, because there's a moment in that episode that feels very Tony Soprano, which is the moment when Bartlett decides to let the guy die, and he just kind of nods to Leo and gives the signal like, I'm not going to stay his execution. It's a cold-blooded moment in a weird way from a character who's so open-hearted. You know, this is very much an episode, not to get heavy, but I do think the parallels with The Sopranos were interesting in that particular episode because, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Bartlett is your Tony Soprano. He's your central character. You know what I mean? Everything kind of revolves around him. And he's such a giving intellect. He's the antithesis of Tony Soprano in so many ways, right? Yeah. And then in that moment, to see him essentially put a hit on a person, right? Like it's a very different situation, but it does feel. What was it like writing that particular episode, which, you know, is very obviously, you know, it deals with the death penalty, which is a big issue, obviously. It's dealt with in a very, I thought, a very interesting way, coming at it through the idea of religion, and Martin Sheen and Bartlett both being religious men. You know, how was that episode broken? Did you guys, you know, was it a thematic thing? Did you come at it from theme and idea first, or how did it work?
Well, it was, at that point, you know, we were still feeling our way about how we were going to write these episodes and construct them.
Sure.
We, you know, by year 2, and when Kevin Falls came in and started running the room, I think we were, in year 2, kind of established the working relationship between the writer's staff and Aaron. Year 1, it was really catch as catch can. And John Wells, who is, you know, like I said, the most experienced showrunner, he was trying to find a way to use the staff and have them relate to Aaron in an optimum way. John's initial plan was, well, look, since Aaron's not going to sit still for, you know, the usual kind of breaking a story and putting an outline on the board and running it by studio and getting notes on the outline and all that, Aaron sits down and writes. So, but Aaron needs, you know, he needs something to write about. Aaron needs story. Aaron needs something to rewrite. Aaron needs something to respond to. So initially, John told all of us, well, then just write a script, a West Wing script on your own with what you know so far about the show and the characters. And weirdly, don't run any of it by Aaron, because he just doesn't have the bandwidth right now. He's always writing, you know, the next script. So I had already had I was already friends with Lawrence O'Donnell. We knew each other, Lawrence was a legend on the Harvard Lampoon when I was writing on the Harvard Lampoon. Lawrence, you could do a whole show about Lawrence too. I mean, and Lawrence and Pat Cadell were both hired as kind of consultants on the show. Lawrence, among as many other credits, had been chief of staff to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I think is still Lawrence, one of the few sort of real life heroes Lawrence has. He's, he's deeply dubious about everybody else's heroes, but he has a few of his own. And so Lawrence brought this wonderful perspective. And Lawrence was also, raised in South Boston, good Catholic Boston boy. So his background was a little bit closer to Bartlett's than certainly me, this half Mennonite from the Midwest. So I was assigned, and Lawrence and I were assigned to not so much write a script, but do a story. Tommy Schlamme was very intent that you guys are good at story. Give Aaron a good story for the next script, and write an outline for it. And I came to Lawrence and said, and it was kind of the dumbest idea. I just said, we just need, how about a 24-hour thing where Bartlett has to make a decision and there's a timeline on it. And, that automatically gives you a good structure. And Lawrence was the one who came up with, well, there hasn't been a federal execution for, at that point, it was almost 10 years. He said Bartlett would have to be one of the first to sign a federal death warrant, since the Supreme Court, once again, legalized capital punishment at the federal level. And we said, great. And it was also something that we were both very passionate about. And I was working with my old writing partner, Ed Redlick, on an organization called Death Penalty Focus, which is devoted to abolishing the death penalty. So I was very versed in the arguments against it, as was Lawrence. But Lawrence had the argument that was most interesting to Aaron, which is, well, the Catholic Church, everyone pays attention to their position on abortion. No politician acknowledges their position on the death penalty. They are just as opposed to the death penalty as they are to abortion. And that really caught Aaron's attention. And I think, I don't remember how much he actually used of our outline, but what I think he really used was the passion both of us brought to this particular issue. Me with my experience with the death penalty opponents, Lawrence with his own experience with, the Catholic position on it, and the arguments. It's very hard to come up with a coherent argument for the death penalty, I find, other than a visceral,
I would say so.
Other than vengeance. It's just a visceral thing that, look, if your kid was killed by an evil person, that person should be killed in turn.
But I'll say this, to that point, you guys do an amazing job in very little time. The Charlie argument is a strong one, right? Yeah. I mean, Bartlett basically says to him, would you want to see the guy that killed your mom executed? And he's like, no, I would want to do it myself. Yeah. And it's powerful. It's incredibly effective in the sense that you don't need anyone else in that episode really giving you a counter argument to it. Yep. Because first of all, everybody loves Charlie, and Dule Hill is tremendous, and it's a beautiful line reading. Mm-hmm. But it's also just like, that's the argument, right? Like that's the counter argument,
and that's the one that's kind of it's. It's where reason fails. It's this sort of visceral at the level of fundamental belief. Yeah. Which you get in politics. There's just people fundamentally, think differently.
So here's another question for you on this. And this does fold into what we're with Take the Sabbath Day. The show does a tremendous job of finding a way to not be politically alienating, I think anyway, I mean, people on the right might say otherwise, but I do feel as though the show tries to be, to some degree or another, balanced, right? Aaron loves an argument. If nothing else, he loves an argument. He loves a balanced argument. He loves two smart people debating something. Right. And so the show does a really good job at that. It's also quite educational. I mean, there are a lot of people that watch the show and learned a lot about civil service, civic duty, all this sort of stuff that comes into politics and why we all hope people are in politics. But I guess my question to you is, when you guys are thinking about this stuff and delineating this information and trying to put it in the mouths of your actors, how do you find that balance? How do you make it not feel preachy? How do you make it feel balanced and also educational at the same time?
I think, well, you put your finger on it, because Aaron would always, his instruction to us, the writers, is just give me an argument. Just give me a good argument, and I can write a scene.
Right.
But, working with him for so long, I also see that it goes further than that. He wants to hear. So our job was really to, as passionately and as wholeheartedly as we could argue both sides, whatever side we wanted to take. We wouldn't want to think up phony arguments for the other side. And I think actually the show got even better in years 2 and 3 when Dee Dee Myers started introducing more conservative consultants.
Interesting.
Who, and not bomb throwers and not idiots, but guys who could very articulately express why they thought something. And or why, someone in the opposite party would do this and would take a principle stand, and it wasn't cynical. But Aaron would always go further and look for that surprise. So all these debates, as good as they are, they always, he makes it a scene, because it's not just a left, right, and center, and here's, that you can get on any cable channel except Fox. But he wants that, but he also wants the surprising, the emotional, the personal turn in the scene, where we find out, about Charlie's mother, where we find out, where it. So the great thing about The West Wing, I think, which it truly did appeal to everybody, is it's always about when the political becomes personal.
Right. Right.
We made the show because we didn't need to make a news program. We didn't need to make something to compete with the other debates on television, which were, that was the big, this was the dawn of cable news and 24/7, and too much, debate, too much argument, too much polarization. We were always interested in, what does it do to the people? And why are the people doing it? And, Aaron will be the first to admit he's very bad at writing bad guys, because his bad guys always wind up. He becomes much more interested in that moment when the bad guy surprises you by coming out with something that you go, oh, well, that's not so bad after all. Or we secretly agree, or the moment, like you say, the Tony Soprano moment, when you're expecting this to be, a wonderful civics lesson on the evils of the death penalty.
Yeah.
And Bartlett just
doesn't. Yeah. And
you realize, the personal cost to someone in the White House is you will be responsible. Your job is uniquely as president is you are responsible for who lives and dies. And you have to take that on. And that's what the whole episode really is about. It's not so much about pro or con death penalty. It's about the cost and the stakes to the person who ultimately has to make that decision.
Well, that's sort of, it's a very powerful episode for a bunch of reasons. But I would say that, you really feel the weight that Martin Sheen brings to it as well. There's something very sort of incredibly powerful about this idea that you're looking for catharsis. You're looking for Bartlett to say, yes, I'm going to say this guy's execution. He doesn't do that. And the catharsis, if there is any, is in him speaking to his priest and confessing his sins and essentially kneeling, kneeling in the Oval Office and feeling the weight of that decision that he's made. It's incredibly powerful. It's amazing television. I would also say too, it taps a little bit into, and I'm curious as to whether or not this affected the writers in any way, but Aaron Sorkin has obviously come from theater. There is a theatrical quality to everything that he writes to some degree or another. there's even hints of magic realism at times. This idea of something larger than us, right? And in this episode, that manifests itself through religion, obviously, and that idea of a higher power, and that sort of theatricality, if you will, of just the idea of two people in a scene. I mean, he loves just two people, right? Like two people on a stage.
Oh, yeah.
So that scene with the priest and Bartlett in the Oval Office, with these beautiful godlike crane shots above them, and this sort of theatrical quality. Are you guys thinking about that as you're writing? Are you thinking about how he's going to, essentially, are you teeing him up in some way to do these type of things, or is this something he brings on his own?
This is very much what Aaron brings on his own. But we're very happy to tee it up.
Sure.
Like I said, the thing that he ultimately respected, and I think the writers who stuck around or had some success, because it was a very difficult show to write. It was very difficult to park your own ego.
Sure.
But that's really what the job was. But if you could just really bring everything you've got and put it on the table about an argument, about something, he would respect that. And he would use that clinically for, dramatic purposes. So, Aaron has no experience being a Catholic, but I think just him listening to Lawrence and Lawrence's own kind of Jesuitical upbringing and everything that that he brought to it, he could immediately put that into Bartlett and Bartlett's experience.
So I have sort of two macro questions for you. The first is Mandy. So I want to kind of, because I do feel like there's stuff that's evident just from what we saw of her character, and also kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier, which is stuff that happens as a show progresses, right?
Right.
You cast a character, you cast a role, you build this role to be a foil or a love interest for Josh, an ex-lover, also something Aaron Sorkin goes back to from time to time. But you bring her in as this sort of spark plug character. Moira does a great job. And then it becomes abundantly clear that she just doesn't fit, right? Like within the administration, the role she plays, the job she has just doesn't really work. Again, not a reflection of Moira's performance in any way, but at a certain point, did you guys when did it become evident that Mandy might not belong for this world, I guess?
Well, it wasn't evident, so much of the show was in formation, that first year. And you almost, and John Wells is very helpful in this too. You have to be, in television particularly, when you're writing it on the run, when you're kind of rebuilding the engine at 90 miles an hour all the time in television, you have to be very open to what's working and what isn't, and do not, be so committed to what you thought the show was or who you thought these characters were. You have to be in this constant feedback loop to what's going on the set, what's going on in the editing room. So we in the writers' room, we were like a few steps removed from that immediate experience because we couldn't be in the editing room. We were coming up with the next episode. We would see the episodes long after, the producers had gone over them and decided about them. But it just became clear at a story level the character was not that useful because everybody else was deeply involved in policy making and making government decisions.
Did we lose him, Will?
An outside consultant is actually, Mandy would have been great if we had been telling a campaign story. I think we figured that out. And that's actually, in the last seasons of the show, it became about a presidential campaign. which is in a way, to me, is a much more sort of most political movies are about political campaigns of who's winning and who's losing and the polls and all that. And in that, a Mandy character would have been central to a primary colors or something like that.
Sure.
But here she's just kind of there to, to either get it wrong or get it right, but on a purely PR level. And the show isn't about, image. The show is about what's going on behind the image. So
she also hurt you guys on a she was a naysayer, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Part of what's wonderful about the show, for all intents and purposes, is that these characters are barreling forward with the best of intentions, right?
Right.
We really want to change the system. We really want to make the country a better place. And then you had Mandy being like, and it's just like and I imagine that roadblock, it makes her. I mean, I think that it was just difficult, and you could sense that she was hurting momentum at times, that she was slowing down storylines.
In the West Wing world, you love these people because they do stand for something. They passionately want to do something.
Yes.
An outside character who's interested in image, that's a satirical character. That's sort of a black comedy. And honestly, being experienced with so much political, it very rarely works. I can't people are always trying it, and writers are always, because writers love to write about writing and image and, lying and all this. They always, those kind of satires, they kind of wind up being toothless to me, because they're never smart enough. They're never really getting at, and they never really get, and, cynicism to me is kind of childish in politics. That's what was real discovery of the West Wing.
Well, it's interesting it's interesting you bring that up, because so rewatching this show and I rewatched Ted Lasso before season 2 started, and I've been watching some Friday Night Lights and what have you. Cynicism is easy. I feel like there's a jadedness to it. It takes courage to write characters that are willing to be so open-hearted and selfless to a certain degree. We should be making more television about trying to be the best of ourselves, not the worst of ourselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why this show holds up, and why this show is so rewatchable, and why this show was a balm for so many people over the last 4 years or so. It fills you with hope. And the idea that is sentimental, I think, is a problem in a bigger sense.
Yeah.
But I want to kind of
really, that hits it. And, I think West Wing is sometimes held up as like, oh, it was some kind of last gasp, or it was a holdover from a more sentimental era of television. And here come the anti-heroes, and here comes Sopranos and Breaking Bad and Mad Men and all that. But I don't see it as that really at all. I think, for one thing, I don't think Sopranos and Breaking Bad and Mad Men are cynical in a way that their imitators try to be, because cynical is very predictable. Cynical gets very boring, because you already know the motives of the characters are bad, and you just expect them to, do bad things. It's much more interesting when you have, this family man trying to hold it together, and he also has to whack some people. It's much more interesting that you have these idealists who are genuinely idealistic. At the same time, they're very smart. They're very, they can deliver one-liners with the best of them. I mean, that's the wonderful thing to me about Aaron's writing is that balancing act of wide-eyed but clear-eyed,
100%.
He kept telling us, always, and I think this was a little bit of a flaw of season 5, honestly, which I stayed around for after Aaron and Tommy left, is season 5. Oh, now we get to do the team kind of turning on each other and fighting each other, and all the, drama is conflict. Let's have our guys conflicted about whether they want to do this job and all that. Aaron would always say, why do you want to watch a show about people who don't want to be where they are? Why would you want to watch a show about people who, these guys have the best job in the world. Why? I don't want to see their doubts about it or their problems with it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I think Aaron has said this in interviews, and one of the things that I truly love about his shows is a sense of camaraderie. The idea of a group of people working towards a common goal. I mean, the reason that one of the reasons that I think he loves writing behind the scenes things so much is because you're seeing all of these people working together. They all love a thing and they all want to make a thing together. It's very similar to obviously making a television show. He's made 2 shows about making a television show.
Yeah.
It's
well,
so
I mean, if you count newsroom.
Yeah.
So
exactly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's, but I think there's something and I couldn't agree with him more. I love being on set. I love sitting around and watching us, hundreds of people coming together to make a thing is just really special. And to your point, with season 5, you get that feeling that they think conflict is better television than people working together, which is an unfortunate choice, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But,
the show very much, by the way, the show very much corrected itself, and I can't take credit for. I think the last seasons of The West Wing was superb.
I agree. I think 6 and 7 are fantastic.
Of, my friends who did stay around and get to carry that through. Yeah.
So I have 2 other questions for you. The first is about character-centric episodes. Somebody's going to emergency, somebody's going to jail is a Sam-centric episode where it's really kind of about him dealing with his with his issues with his father and what's sort of going on there. This show very beautifully does character-centric episodes. When you were doing that episode, or quite frankly any of your episodes, did you find yourself sort of, is it different writing for different characters, or was it just sort of, did you have to get yourself into a Toby headset to do a Toby centric episode or a Sam centric episode? Was it in any way different?
We the writers, the rest of the writing staff, we would be responsible for individual sort of storylines. And Aaron would, put it all together. And, Aaron, 50% of the stories in every episode would come out of Aaron's head, at least.
Right. Right.
But we did learn that, if you would always start with, okay, he needs a story, we need an issue, we need something. And then the next step was like, okay, that's working. Whose story should it be? And it became, on just a, mechanical level, Josh was more responsible for policy than CJ was, at least in the early days. CJ was in her own kind of silo of all the media related stories, which, by the way, I think is a reason she supplanted Mandy and, kept, feeding out of Mandy's puppy dish than in the first season, because all those stories were like better for the press secretary. So Toby honestly was the one I had the most fun writing for, because I think Toby is the slightly misanthropic, as a writer. I mean, Toby of all of them, could have been a TV writer very easily. Totally. Yeah. Sam and Josh were just too extroverted and too handsome, and
So so please go ahead. Sorry,
and then there was always the A story, which is, my joke is every episode, cops, it's always about shooting somebody, and lawyers, it's about getting someone, changed. They're all shows are life and death. All good dramas are life and death. West Wing was all about getting the president to sign something. That was the ultimate objective of every episode, is you got to get the guy's signature on something. But that was life-changing, and it's, in the biggest sense. So it's always like, well, what is sort of the big Bartlett moment, Oval Office moment? And we were smart enough not to do that every episode. I mean, like you said, the character, like the episode, like someone's going to emergency, did, though I think I originally pitched that thinking it would be a Josh episode.
Interesting.
Because it was, Josh is so much the like a lot of ardent liberals I know and knew, would idealize, and it's all based on it's kind of beat for beat based on the actual Alger Hiss story of a man who was taken down as a traitor and idolized and idealized by the left. And it's only recently that we recognize the truth. In fact, I got a heartbreaking letter from, I think, Alger Hiss's granddaughter about really, how could you? Because she knew what the story was based on. But that, to me, is what made it such a great drama. And I think it was almost at that point, Aaron realized he had been maybe giving a little too much to Brad and shortchanging Rob. I found this in his other writing. He loves all his actors equally, but there will always be the actor who is kind of the glamour puss in the show, and that everyone else thinks is a little bit of the lightweight. I'm remembering Newsroom. She's wonderful. Now, of course, I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember her name now, but
Olivia Munn.
Olivia Munn. She was this pinup girl. How you're not going to give a good story to Olivia Munn? And Aaron, God bless him, found out she could actually speak Japanese. So, well, I'm going to write her a story. We're going to do the Fukushima episode, and she just stunned us because I don't know if you're.
She turned into one of the best characters on the show.
She became one of the best characters on the show in the same way that Sam. It goes back to that meeting at Sports Night. Well, what do you think of Rob Lowe? Rob Lowe has so many crayons in the box. Rob Lowe can do so much, including that drama. I mean, that scene when he's just throwing the sugar packets, I think that must have been improv on the set, just into that metal basin or something. And so, I'm going to go tell her. I'm going to go tell her. And then he runs upstairs. And that's only because we, at that point, had built a staircase set. So we had a lower level on the West Wing for the first time, that Tommy used that to make that very dramatic. And then, he can't tell her the truth. I'm
going to tell this girl who her father really was. Yeah. It's amazing stuff. I want to kind of, I have one last question for you that kind of feeds into a newsroom question. I got to ask what it was like on the West Wing after 9/11. It was obviously a horrific event that we're still, quite frankly, living in the fallout of. Yeah. And
it did change everything.
It changed everything, right? You guys are, I'm assuming,
politics, 9/11 is the reason we'll never be able to do another West Wing.
Right. Yeah. So but my question is sort of, from a production perspective, you guys are already, producing episodes for season 3.
We were we were halfway through the script of the Halloween episode.
Right. So you guys are pretty deep into season 3 at this point.
Yeah.
And this horrible thing happens. And Aaron decides to write this standalone episode, the Isaac and Ishmael episode that airs before the premiere. Understandably, he feels like he has to somehow, acknowledge this horrible thing that's happened within the universe of his show. Mm-hmm. My question is sort of more macro as to what was it like trying to write this show in a world that had so drastically changed? Did you find that the show? Season 3 ends with Bartlett killing a terrorist, for lack of a better way of putting it. No. Did the show change? Did you feel like it changed? Did the Bartlett administration change because of it?
Well, in a funny way, I mean, obviously things radically changed the day of, and we were shut down, and even arriving for work at the studio. And I don't know when we were first kind of allowed back in the studio, but we were all under high alert, and there were the German shepherds and the guys with mirrors running them under the chassis of your car. I think we're all still kind of PTSD if you've lived through that. It's very hard to remember just how bizarre and how sort of stomach in your throat you went through your days for weeks afterwards. But in a funny way, and what I think people also forgetting, and this is before Iraq and Afghanistan and WMDs and big lies, that it was a kind of shining moment for the presidency, for the White House. It was truly a crisis presidency. It was, looking back, and I'm now, kind of immersing myself in the lead up to Iraq, kind of trying to understand that they were actually all doing their best. Everyone, even the ones we regard now as villains, were certainly trying to do the right thing at every minute and for the highest possible stakes. So in a weird way, it was a fulfillment of what the show had started doing,
That's interesting.
And then, it did introduce a darkness into the show, which I think only helped it. I mean, Bartlett's own sort of big lie about the MS, which had begun in season 1 with the state dinner episode. So I take a little credit. That's
one of my favorite scenes.
Pitched the story. I pitched the story to Aaron while he was rewriting State Dinner. Well, Bess Truman always hated the White House, and Bess Truman made Harry promise that he wouldn't run for a second term. And Aaron went, because now he had the great scene with him, with Martin and Stark at Channing. I'm sitting here eating a sandwich. So thank you, Bess Truman. But then the darkness of the MS, and then the real darkness, and I don't know if Lawrence was still around, but I know I became very immersed because I'm always such a thriller fan in the role of, the Pakistani intelligence services in aiding and abetting our enemies, even while we're supporting their government. I thought that was a tremendously paradoxical, dramatic. And I think actually the writers still give me credit for naming Kumar, the country. Oh yes, this was my little weird celebrity in West Wing. Is I'm responsible for the names of all the fictional countries.
That's cool.
The Central Equatorial Republic of Kundun in Africa. That's me. Kumar is me. I think there's a few.
That's amazing. I mean, I think that it's really, the show very deftly, navigates some pretty choppy waters in terms of what the world was like after this horrific event, and not losing its sense of potential and hope and what can be achieved by government. And I think that that's really important. The reason I asked you the question really was just because it does feel like it's a real kind of fork in the road thing, right? I mean, if I was gun to my head was forced to pick a favorite season, I would probably say season 2, because the season 2 feels like the show really at the peak of its powers. It understands itself. It beautifully comes back on itself. I mean, the finale and the premieres are such lovely bookmarks. It just really feels like a wonderful season of television. And it's not to take anything away from seasons 3 and 4, but you certainly feel like the show's changed a little bit, and that the world's changed a little bit. And you do feel that. It's not necessarily for the worse, but I just wanted to sort of hone in on whether or not it changed the way you guys made the show.
Other than, well, as you said, I think we really hit our stride as a functioning show and a functioning writer's room in season 2. And really, we could have, I think the show, just based on what could have gone for a full 7 years, 10 years with Aaron at the helm, based on that model. But things did change, and there was just the stress of making 22 of them. I think in today's kind of streaming cable environment, if you only had to, Newsroom, to me, it was a dream working on the, season 1 of the Newsroom, because we only had to do, 9 of them?
Yeah.
And every script was in on time. We got a chance to even revise the scripts. And HBO, of course, HBO treats you like kings. It's like
yeah,
queens.
budgets, I imagine are just you can do whatever you want. Yeah. Well, that you bring up newsroom, and I wanted to ask that. I wanted to ask about that because I in terms of the choice to use real events,
yes,
which is a choice.
Honestly, for the first, Aaron pitched me the show and two other friends from the old West Wing days, Eli Addy and Kevin Falls. I remember Aaron inviting us all to dinner and saying, well, what do you think of this? And he started describing, his latest foray into TV. And we said, well, that all sounds tremendous. He said, yeah, but what am I going to do? I mean, I've got to, do I make up headlines? Do I make up news? And they said, well, I wish we could help. And then, and I remember him saying, I'll pay any amount of money, you guys. Just come on board and help me out. And Eli and Kevin were both, I think,
they're like
deeply involved. No, they had other shows and they were committed to. I think, Kevin's always doing some great show, and Eli, I think, was tied to House at the time, or one of them. And I was Twix Picks, as we say in Hollywood. So they turned to me after Aaron Led said, you should do it. You should do it. I said, what is this? But the call came and Aaron showed me the pilot and I thought, oh, that's great. He said, yeah, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do the headlines from a year ago. We're going to be this weird historical drama, but the history is only 1 year old.
Right.
So, okay. And, we're getting off 1999 now into the future, but we had the most fun, just doing this whole timeline that ran right under the ceiling of the writer's room about all the events of a year ago and which headlines, which news stories we're going to do. And I think we did, a reasonably good job, but it was such a rebus, such a Rubik's Cube trying to fit the actual news stories into, again, making the journalistic personal. How do we fit this into the personal stories of this, struggling newsroom that's reinventing itself? It just became a very, very tall order. And I think,
there's also an element. Sorry, please. Yeah.
Well, as I think as it went on, it became very clear that, the news stories, it was just too hard to have every week centered on a different actual headline.
There's also a tension that's lost a little bit when you know how it plays out, right?
Exactly. There's It's to me, it's the problem with all sports shows too. Though Sports Night solved it by making it again about sports media, but making a show that's a drama about sports, and I think Ted Lasso solves it because it's a comedy about sports. But a drama about sports, you're taking away the inherent dramatic thing of how's it going to turn out. Well, and unless you're Friday Night Lights and it's all about family and all that. But if it's always about the big game and it's always like, well, are they going to win or are they going to lose? West Wing, in contrast to Newsroom, West Wing, we had a much bigger field to play in. We of course we used headlines. We used every single significant policy and story that had happened to the White House. But for the last 20 or 30 years, I mean, we were doing things that, JFK had to deal with, as well as, gays in the military or whatever was much more current. But we tried to do like perennial presidential problems as much as we could, which is why the show, I think, still holds up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that the sports analogy is an interesting one. I remember I saw a panel once of some Parenthood writers who were also on Friday Night Lights, and I think about a season into Parenthood, they were just like, "We'll give anything for a football game. I mean, anything, just give us something to hold on to." So it's a curse and a blessing, right? Like it's a double-edged sword when it comes to working within a formula in any way, really, right? Because at a certain point, it can feel repetitive, or it can be just hard to crack every week.
Right. And how much does your drama need to overlap with real life? And how much does it preempt it? And how much are you just redundant? I mean, I think a basic problem with, every other political show besides The West Wing is, well, wait a minute, the real politics are much more interesting than this. And a
Well, that's
newsroom show is a real problem because wait, there's the real news, and you're not reporting anything different about the midterm election. You're just kind of giving a harangue about the midterm election and the rise of the Tea Party. Okay, well, you know, you can read about the rise of the Tea Party in Wikipedia. We can't tell people anything they don't know about the rise of the Tea Party, whereas we can tell people a lot about what they don't know about what goes into a decision, you know, to assassinate a foreign leader or what goes into the U.S. Census or something like that. I mean, again, we made a point in the West Wing, and Aaron laid this out early on, and I think we really respected it, is every episode we have to tell our audience something about the White House, which they didn't know.
And
like
you do
the
that
famous Lincoln bust, which is now, you know, I don't know where that came from. I don't even know if it's true. But the fact that the Lincoln bust will always be angled depending, you know, to give a code word about the president's mood. I think that may have been from the Clinton administration, or it's just a myth. It's a good story anyway.
I think it's interesting what you're saying in terms of how hard it is to make a West Wing or a newsroom today, because I do think that, I mean, politics and the news have been perverted and sort of mutated in such a way, especially over the Trump administration, that I think it's just so hard for us to put any credibility in these things, right? Like, you know, the hardest thing Joe Biden has to do in this administration is bring back credibility and trust to something that we never thought could be tarnished in this way. And I mean, forget about what Newsmax and Fox News and various, you know, far right organizations are doing to the idea of truth and what that means. I mean, it's shocking, but it's part of why I think this show was not just brilliant, but it's important. I mean, it's a document of something. And it's, you know, a lot of people, I had Alan Sepinwall and Emily Vanderwerf on for the pilot of this show for an episode where I talked about the pilot. And you know, Emily has very interesting thoughts about the ramifications of this show in terms of the expectations of politics. The idea that people watch the show and think, oh, well, that's the way it should be. But is it even possible, quote unquote, for it to do that? Right. I mean, was Obama, you know, given a bar that was just not possible to hit because of a show like this? Right. And it's possible that that's true. And I don't hold that against the show. I hold that against the American people. But but I do, you know, So I guess I'm just sort of wondering what your thoughts are on its legacy and what it's like to watch the show through a 2021 lens now.
I think its legacy is well, I have to say this, but I do think it's positive. I mean, I'm very proud of it.
Sure.
I do
as you should be.
You know, a personal experience of a few years ago of going. It was the I think the last months of the Obama administration of going to Washington on behalf of a group lobbying for intellectual property rights and against piracy. And the host sort of mentioned in passing, "Oh, would you like to drop in on the speech writing shop at the West Wing? Because they'd all love to talk to you." I said, "Okay." And it wasn't in the West Wing, of course. It was in the old executive office building, but it was virtually the West Wing. They all looked 12 years old to me. They were all in their 20s. And I come in, and they had all gathered together because, you know, they were a bit at loose ends for the first time because everything was winding down. And I guess I had interrupted a discussion about whether Donna was actually a good secretary or not. Is Donna actually a good assistant? Because they had all memorized every episode. Yeah. And they were all very upfront as, we're doing this because of the West Wing. Yeah. This set our aspirations. And I looked around, I get it. And these are, you know, and of course, I hope some of them went into television because all of them were very eager to, you know, because what are you going to do if you're in your 20s, you have the coolest job in the world? I guess you could stick around Washington, stay in politics, or you can try and expand. But, you know, I didn't really have that much to say to kind of bask in this. Oh, okay. Yeah. And like I said, it was a show that cured me of my 20s cynicism. Yeah. Not because of the show itself, because of the people I got to talk to, and right and left. And, another experience, another dinner, I think it was actually on this same group lobbying Capitol Hill, talking to a member of, I won't name his name, but he's a member of the Freedom Caucus, and everything he out of his mouth and everything he stands for, I despise. At the same time, he talked about the joy of sitting down with his daughters and watching every episode of The West Wing, which I would think is this liberal fantasy. And it's like, no,
oh my God.
That's, this is a ex-Baptist preacher, and that's what he wants to aspire. He wants to be Josh and Bartlett, and they want to be CJ. And it's like, well, why not? I mean, I met the real CJ, Dee Dee Myers. There is no reason to be cynical about Dee Dee. She's fantastic and doing the hardest job in the world. We had a Ken Duberstein, the guy who got Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, the guy who was Reagan's last chief of staff. And Dee Dee said, yeah, you're going to think you're meeting the devil. You'll be eating out of his hand in half an hour. And it was true. The guy was so winning, so charming, and so upfront about his own opinion about certain members of his own party and what the party had become after Reagan. And it's just, wow. So they're all hooked on the same drug, which is making a difference. This power to actually make a difference. And the thing that's crept in, in the Trump era and the alt-right era, when it seems like politics is being run by people who don't do politics, by people who sit in front of a camera and a microphone and get a crowd worked up.
The grift.
It's the grift. It's the sham. It goes back to Mark Twain. I mean, con men have been running, are as American as you can get. And there's nothing more American than a con man president. I mean, all the great ones, FDR was, seen for what he was. I mean, he was a traitor to his class and Johnson. I mean,
I do think that to sort of come back to the idealism of the show, I guess I just don't subscribe to the idea that idealism is bad. It's an ideal. It's a thing that we should be striving for, right? We should be looking towards the horizon and trying, to push ourselves. Now, is the West Wing unrealistic, quote unquote? I don't really care if it's unrealistic, quite frankly, because it should be something to strive for. Yeah. When you talk about these people that work at the actual West Wing, watching this show and thinking, I want to try to emulate that, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, the question becomes whether or not people being unrealistic in politics is problematic for the greater scheme of getting things done and actually moving the ball. And you know better than anybody how difficult it is to actually change things, actually pass bills, actually move things through this government. It's difficult. But you got to take big swings. You got to aim for the stars, right? I mean, otherwise this idea of just sort of like aiming for the middle all the time just feels kind of pointless to me. I don't know. I think you should obviously be incredibly proud of this show, but I would also just say that I think that its legacy is in what you're saying right now, that you have people in politics today of all stripes watching this show and taking something positive away from it. There's nothing bad about that. Yeah. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I first, more than anything, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to sit here and talk with me about this. But to be able to get a window into the process and how this show was made, a show that I've watched innumerable times, it is just I'm watching season 2 right now. So it's just I love it to death. It makes me unreasonably happy, and I hope that that's all you can ask for from your viewers and our listeners. So I really do appreciate you taking the time, Paul.
And that's why I want to keep going. I so miss. The agony and the ecstasy of that writer's room.
Sure.
I miss Aaron. I miss that cast. I just love watching them to continue. And I want to continue in some form or another. And
Sure.
I mean, my only difficulty is, and for this I really blame Trump. It's now seems impossible to sell any kind of political show or something dealing with politics. Though I'm certain the circle will come around, because
it will.
When Aaron sold West, I mean, you know the story that West Wing kind of sat on the shelf for a year because all the smart money in television said political shows never work.
Plus, you're in the middle of a scandal on the Monica Lewinsky thing was happening, like right as that's happening. You know, I think that, first of all, I agree with you 100%. I think a political show is definitely in our future. I think that there is a hunger for positivity in politics, a hunger for real, systemic change. I think that this anger and this wound that Trump sort of tore the scab off of and exposed to us is ultimately, hopefully, a good thing. We have to acknowledge this wound. We have to acknowledge these problems. We have to work towards making them better. We can't just turn a blind eye to stuff. We have to listen to everybody on the political spectrum. It needs to be a country that is an entire political spectrum, not flanks of the far left and the far right. And I think that someone will find a way into that political drama, perhaps even yourself, that will sort of, bring it all together and do it all over again. Because I think there's an appetite for it. I mean, there's an appetite for a West Wing revival if someone decided to do such a thing. So
yeah.
So there's that.
Aaron keeps talking about it, but we'll see.
I hope he does it. I
think you're right, because to me, cynicism is a way of flattering the powerless.
Yes.
Telling it you're powerless for a reason.
Yeah.
You're going to stay powerless, but it's not worth it because the ones in power are shits. I think the much more, and the message of Trump is trying to, no, the powerless want to be empowered. And if you can have a show that says, no, you may feel powerless now, but we actually, don't give up. Climate change can be addressed. Systemic racism, it's not just exposing them. It's, well, what are you going to do about it? And you can do something about it.
Well, I would also, I would say that I would love to see a political drama that is about smaller government. And by that, I mean people that work in Congress, a show about a senator, a show about the day-to-day, because the reality is that the politicians that are closest to the American people are the ones that are, quote unquote, the less interesting ones, right? Or what they believe to be, because the president is cool and all the various things that come with that. But I just think that really getting into the nuts and bolts of being a congressman or a mayor or whatever, something along those lines. I mean, I think Parks and Rec is one of my favorite shows ever. And one of the reasons that I love that show is because it's just about a Parks and Rec department.
It's about filling a hole. It's like,
it's great. So that I would love to see someone run with that. Yeah, all politics is local, exactly. Yeah. But honestly, Paul, thank you so much for being here and for talking with me and answering questions that I've honestly had, no joke, for probably 20 years. Well, so I really do appreciate it.
Whenever you want it.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.